Here's the awkward thing about talking about my very favorite books. What's awkward is that I almost never go back and reread a book. The problem is that my list of books that I have to read that I've never read before is over 50 titles long, and somehow, no matter how much I read, that number never seems to go down. To take the time to reread a book I've already read means that it's longer before I can get to that list. Now here's where that's a problem when it comes to ranking my favorite books. Some of these books in this pile here I haven't read in maybe 20 or more years, and as I discussed in my first video in my tattoo series, we change so much as people as time goes on. The things that are so important to you 10, 15, 20 years ago even may not be at all important to you now. Or maybe they are, but the point is that if I've read a book 20 years ago and was like, this is one of the best books I've ever read, who knows what I would think about it if I were to read it now. Here's one example. When I was a kid, I absolutely loved all of the Asterix books and the Tintin books. So a little while ago, I thought I'd pull out an Asterix book to read to my kids. And as I got into it, I was like, wow, this is just full of senseless, stupid violence. Sure, it's full of clever puns and fun plays on words and stuff, but the kids would never pick up on that. All they see is a bunch of people beating the bejesus out of each other for whatever reason. So I didn't even make it through that Asterix book. And while Tintin books aren't quite so chock full of that violence, they do contain some pretty uncomfortable racism. So yeah, who knows what I would think about some of these books in my current mindset and my current place in life. But with that caveat being out of the way, let's dive into my top 10. And just before I hit number 10, I'm going to do an honorable mention with another comic, Calvin and Hobbes. Now this is the comic that has held up for me over the years, and as I get older I just appreciate more and more. There's just so much life wisdom in here, so much great humor. I love Calvin and Hobbes even after all this time, so I'm going to just throw that in as an honorable mention before I get into my number 10, which is an example of one of these books I haven't read in forever, and it is Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. This is a retelling of the ancient myth of Cupid and Psyche, told in a different setting in novel form. It's been a couple of decades since I've actually read it, but the main thing that stuck out to me about the book was it was really a book about beauty. The fond memory I have of the book caused me to repurchase it recently, because I'm not sure what happened to my original copy, and maybe one of these days I'll get around to rereading it and seeing what I think about it. If I do, I'll make a video about it, but don't hold your breath for that. Number 9 is an old classic, but before I dive into it, let me tell you a bit about my history with books. When I was a kid, my grandparents one Christmas got me this box of about 24 books that were called pocket classics. And what they had done was they had taken these works of classic literature and they had turned them into miniature books where every other page was an illustration. And they were geared towards getting kids into classic novels. So as a result, I developed a bit of a love for classic literature from a pretty young age. Then as I got a little bit older, I started to explore the full unabridged versions of these books that I had enjoyed the stories of in smaller format. And my favorite genre within the classics were heroic adventure novels. So some of my very favorite books as a kid were Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott, The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, The White Company by Arthur Conan Doyle, whose Sherlock Holmes books I also loved quite a lot. Robin Hood, this one's by Howard Pyle. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And my very favorite book when I was a kid, Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. This was my favorite book for years, throughout most of my childhood, but if I were to read it now, I don't know what I'd think about it. This is actually one that I probably will reread just for the sake of seeing if it's worthwhile giving it to my kids to check out at some point. But I just don't know if I would enjoy these books now. At the very least, I'm sure I'd be going, do these authors even know what a female is? So it's hard to know. So that's just a bit about my background with the classics, and my number 7 book here is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. I've only ever read 2 Dickens novels, the other one being Great Expectations, but there's something about Charles Dickens where he has an incredible way with the English language. I've never quite read an author who has the same way with words and with language as Charles Dickens. His books are kind of a dense read, so I don't know if I would check out his other stuff like David Copperfield or whatever, because nowadays my attention span just isn't there and I'm more into the faster moving novels. But Working your way through a Dickens novel is certainly a rewarding experience. Number 8 is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. I have read a couple of other Cormac McCarthy novels, and in general I found them to be sort of filled with pretty mindless violence. I wasn't super into them. But I read The Road not long after becoming a father, and there's something about this story of a father-son relationship in a post-apocalyptic world that really hit me in the heart. And while it is kind of a rough and tragic story, it is also full of beauty, and I was really quite enthralled with it. So up next we're going to dive into some classic fantasy with Tolkien's series, starting with The Hobbit, and then going on to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. There's something about Tolkien's world that just draws you right into it, and he's simply an undoubted pioneer within the high fantasy genre. I initially had these books read to me when I was a young kid by my parents, and then as a teen I read through them myself for the first time, and again as an adult. And there's just nothing quite like the story and the world that Tolkien has created here. However, there's a possibility that this could be knocked off of my top 10 list by another trilogy, and this is the Kingkiller Chronicles trilogy by Patrick Rothfuss. He's written the first 2 books, The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear, and we're still awaiting that 3rd book. But eventually when it's released, I'll go back and reread the first 2 books so I can read all 3 of them together. And Patrick's writing is just so deliberate and thoughtful, and the story so interesting that it could very well kick the Lord of the Rings out of my top 10, but we'll have to wait and see with that. Number 6 now is my most recent read on this list, and it's Days Without End by Sebastian Barry. I did create a video about this book fairly recently, so I won't talk too much about it, but it's a historical novel about a trans person in an era where trans issues weren't even recognized yet. It's a wonderfully written novel about important subjects, and I'll provide the link to the video I made about it in the comments below and maybe at the end of this video too. But if you're interested in trans issues, definitely also check out Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides. It's another beautiful story about a trans person, and one I'd recommend you check out. For number 5, we're going to go back to the classic literature again, and this is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. Obviously, this is a very famous musical, but the thing is, I'm totally not into theater and musicals, just not really my thing. And so I was actually first introduced to this story through a movie. It wasn't the most recent movie that was made, but one before that. And when I watched the movie, I was really blown away by the theme of grace that was told within the story. And so I enjoyed the movie so much that I sought out this novel, which is a massive novel that could have been maybe half the length had Victor Hugo left out all the tangents that were barely related to the plot that he was telling. For instance, there was a whole story about the Battle of Waterloo that was told just to indicate one aspect of one character's personality, but the actual history of it really fascinated me. The most irritating one was right towards the end of the book when he's reaching the climactic scenes. He decides to go on this whole sidetrack about the sewer system of Paris during this era, and you just want him to get back to the action, but he's talking all about the sewer system. And it's something that is a little bit frustrating, but at the same time a lot of these tangents really help to set the novel within the historical period in which it's written, and I actually quite enjoyed most of them. You did get to learn a lot about the history, about the geography, about the people of that time, and it really helped to enrich the story that was being told, I think. And it wasn't until after watching that movie and reading this book that I actually finally got to see the Broadway play. My wife and I happened to be in New York on, I think it was the very last day that Les Miserables was being shown to the public before it came off of Broadway, so we took advantage of it to go see it. And despite my lack of interest in musicals, I really enjoyed it. And the thing that impressed me the most about it was that they had stuck much more true to the book than the movie had. So yeah, Les Miserables is my number 1 classic work of fiction for sure. Now we'll dive back into the fantasy genre for my number 4, which is a 2-part book, I guess a duology that would be called, by Guy Gavriel Kay, called Sailing to Sarantium and Lord of Emperors. The actual fantasy in these novels is quite light. They're more along the lines of historical fiction, to be honest with you. What Guy Kay likes to do in a number of his novels is take a historical setting with historical characters and sort of rework them just a tad and place them within his own world. So direct parallels can be drawn between the locations in the book to real world locations, and characters within the book to real world personalities, and events and religions and all that stuff. But Guy Kay just renames them for his own world so that he can be free to take whatever liberties he wants with the history, and so that he can throw in some smatterings of fantasy into the mix. This particular two-part book is about a mosaicist during the Byzantine era, which you might hear that and go, what? That doesn't sound at all interesting. But it actually has very interesting things to say about the role of art within society, and the role of art within the individual artist, and the need to leave something of beauty in the world that will outlast our own lives. At the same time, it's a really well told story, and it's a lot of fun to read, so I enjoy it a great deal. These pictures actually match up together. Look at that! Never noticed that before. It looks like it's all one picture. Cool. I tend to really enjoy Guy Kay's books. I did a video on his high fantasy trilogy, The Fionavar Tapestry. I can link that for you, but that was another really amazing, wonderful series of a completely different fantasy style than the Fionavar Tapestry. So moving along to my top 3 works of fiction of all time that I've just dumped on the floor. Number 3 is Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. I don't think any novel has had me laughing out loud so much as Catch-22, and yet it's this sort of tragic humor where it's based on history and is very much based on the author's experiences during the Second World War. But his view of the world and his telling of this story is just so funny. In fact, this is one of the rare books that I have gone back to reread, and I enjoyed it just as much or more than the first time I read it. That being said, I did lend it to somebody who was just completely unimpressed with it and didn't bother to finish reading it, so I don't know if you have to have an appreciation for Second World War history or military history to really get the most out of this novel, but for me it just hit me right in the funny bone. My number 2 book here was my number 1 book for quite some time, and this is The Brothers K by David James Duncan, the title being an obvious nod to Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. But the story behind this novel is maybe about 20 years ago, I don't know, maybe even more. One of my brothers, who's also an avid reader, had gotten to know the owner of a local bookstore. And this bookstore owner had said to him one day, I have a book for you to buy, and if you don't think it is the best novel you've ever read, I will take it back and give you a full refund regardless of the condition the book is in. So my brother read the book, and it was the best book he had ever read at the time. So of course I had to read it, and it was also the best book I had ever read at the time. It's a huge sweeping story of 4 siblings who grow up together in America. And it's actually really weird that I would like this book because it's sort of based around the sport of baseball. I'm really not into sports, and I especially hate baseball. I just find it so incredibly boring. So the fact that I would like a book that is based around baseball, and not only like it, but consider it my number 1 book for many years, is a testament to how good the story is. That being said, this is also the book that sort of turned me off from recommending books to other people, because I loaned it to 2 different people who started into it and were like, I can't get into this. And I don't know if it was the baseball thing or the fact that it was maybe a bit of a slow start at the beginning of the book, but I guess it made me realize that the appreciation of books is just like the appreciation of any other art form like music or visual art or whatever, in that it's so extremely subjective to a person's individual tastes. I don't know what I would think about the book now because it's been so many years since I've read it, but I'm pretty confident I would still enjoy it a lot. My number 1 book is the book that displaced that one as my number 1 favorite work of fiction of all time, and it is The Cider House Rules by John Irving. This is such a beautiful story, and it is an amazing example of John Irving's masterful storytelling ability, in which he takes this big sweeping story with all these different elements and works all these elements together towards a wonderful conclusion. I talked about John Irving in another video I did, which once again I can link for you. And in that video I discussed how 2 of Irving's novels really blew me away. The first one I read was actually A Prayer for Owen Meany, and I absolutely loved it. I thought it could be one of my favorite books until I read The Cider House Rules and liked it even more. And so I thought I had maybe found my favorite living author, and I went on to read a number of his other novels, and every single one of them disappointed me. So while I can't recommend these 2 books highly enough, there's something about the rest of his books that really didn't do it for me. I've heard that the movie The Cider House Rules is quite good, so I'll have to check that out sometime. And if you have any suggestions for me about books I should read or other top 10 lists I should do, I do need some more ideas for my top 10 list, so please let me know in the comments below. Thanks. Holy cow, you made it to the end of this video. That really does mean a lot to me. The other thing that means a lot to me is if you would give it a thumb up or subscribe to my channel, or maybe share this video with one person that you think would enjoy it. Cheers. The problem is my books of list? Puns and fun plays on words. I just spat again. His books are kind of a dense read. And I don't know if I would ever go back to... His books are kind of a dense read, so I don't know if I would go and check out... His books are kind of a dense read. His books are kind of a dense read, and I don't know if I'd ever go back and... His books are kind of a dense read, and I don't know if I'd ever read... His books are kind of a dense read, and I don't know if I would go back and read... Oh my god. It's been a couple of decades since I've actually read it, but the main thing that struck out to me... It could very well replace my... It could very well... Of course I will do a video of it if... Of course I will do a video if I ever... Of course I'll have to do a video if I... Of course someday I'll have to do a video if I ever get that whole trilogy read. Whatever. This particular two-part book has books like Ivanhoe. Ooh.